Alexandru Balasescu es director adjunto del Instituto Cultural Romano de Cultura en Estambul, y básicamente nos está visitando esta pasión en una serie de eventos apoyados por los posgrados en antropología y por la maestría en estudios culturales y la Universidad de Rosario. Alex Balasescu ha escrito sobre ciudad, sobre sostenibilidad urbana, y su libro Paris Chic, Terrain Drills trata acerca del estudio comparativo entre el uso del velo en París y Teherán. Está muy emocionado de estar por primera vez en Latinoamérica y muy atento a lo que ustedes tengan que, digamos, reaccionar frente a lo que está planteando en términos de espacio público y en términos de, básicamente, el cuerpo y el vestido como herramientas metodológicas para abordar muchos temas de la ciudad. Entonces le damos la bienvenida a Alexandru y mil gracias por estar acá.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Buenos días a todos. Soy muy feliz de a Bogotá. Yo no hablo español. So this is where my Spanish stops, and I will talk in English. First, I would like to thank Andrés Salcedo, my colleague, and the Department of Anthropology and the University of Nacional, Bogotá, for having me here and for facilitating my stay in Bogotá. And today I will talk about a subject that has been in my mind for quite a few years, and in fact it's a sort of key through which I see urban developments in, let's say, in today's world. Some call it neoliberal age, some others call it post-globalized world, because globalization is not anymore in fashion. But I'm very, very interested in what transparency means, and what does it mean visibility, and why is such a sort of overarching theme in architecture, although it's never talked, or almost never talked about in a straight way. Because transparency in itself is a political category also. Now we talked about transparent governments and transparent institutions, and we have transparent buildings and transparent offices, open offices. So what better way to look at transparencies than to look at the objects that stops us from seeing? And one of the objects that I use and I thought about for many years is the Islamic veil. How this all started, why was I thinking about it, was because I lived in France in '97 first, when I was doing my master's degree, on a theme that has to do with priority urbanization at the edge of the city. And it was the place where North African, mostly Muslim migrants were living. And by that time, the dispute was the dispute between, let's say, the idea of integration, political integration of the migrants in France in '97 was not yet centered around the woman's body and around the veil. So I didn't even look at it. The veil was not visible. That was very interesting. Just a few years later, 1 year later, 98, 99, the veil, the so-called the veil scandal, ignited in France. How did it start? It started with two girls that were banned by the principal at the school to come at school if they wear the veil. The veil is not, don't imagine the burqa, the thing that covers the face, and you see usually the Afghan woman's images. The veil is looks like a scarf. Yeah, it's a scarf that you put on the head. And there are many ways of looking at it. Well, that's how it started, and it became a national debate in France, the veil. Should we keep the veil? Should we forbid it by law? Should we not? And those who were for the law, for enforcing the renunciation to the veil, had two arguments. First was that schools and any other type of public institutions are in fact privileged space of creating the citizen. And France, since 1911, is a secular state, laïc, they say laïc, which is somehow different. I'm not going to enter into the difference between secular and laïc, but in 1911 in France there was a law that stated clearly that the religion's affairs and the state affairs are completely separate. So, one of the arguments of the law, these are two arguments that are synthesized, there are many others, but one of them is that the education should remain laic, secular, and not only that, but all the other institutions that have to do with the state should be free of religious symbols. And the second argument, which is even more debatable if you look at it, was that the veil is a sign of women's oppression and it's a clear sign of religious belonging. Well, those who are anti-law, they said, wait a minute. First of all, it's not our brothers or it's not our fathers who made us wear the veil, we took it up. It's a free choice. It's something that, for us, it's an object that it's a sign of more of a political choice. And it became so with the dispute. The sign of a political choice more so than the sign of oppression. Also, they argued that it's about discrimination, ethnic or religious discrimination in schools. The school that is public should remain public. And of course, having in mind this, the law was portrayed as being a discriminatory law, an attack to personal freedom. Well, this is how the debate was framed. Now, in order to look at those things, I will argue that there is an intricate relation between the space and visibility that is at the core of the dispute. And it has much less to do with religion than it has to do with these terms, with these categories, the space and the visibility. And it reveals us more the structure of French citizenship assumptions than anything about Islam. That's my main argument. So, I just want to make a step back and look at architecture. And look at the way in which public space has been produced in a post-Enlightenment era in France. Yeah, so I start with this because I really like the quote. The eye is a product of history reproduced by education. Which basically means that unlike what this has been said, that what you see is what you get. No, in fact, it's what you see is what you expect to see and what you are trained to see. Now there is the famous story with the caravelas of Colombia who were not, for like 2 weeks, nobody saw them because the indigenous people were expecting to see such things. And probably there was some shaman who revealed to them that there are some objects there that look like this and like this. And they were revealed to the eyes because of the waves changing around the objects themselves, but not the object. It's an interesting story. I don't know if it's true or not, but it's a nice way to look at it. So, the argument is that the ways of seeing in the public space and how the visible is structured has to do with the way we constructed this space. And as there is no visibility in the absence of the invisible, and it is often necessary to close one's eyes to understand the image through its light, So the public space does not emerge without its complementary private realm. Now, the way in which we design streets, the modern streets in Europe, was based on the introduction of the point of view, the vista point, or the vanishing point, which was introduced in Europe in the Renaissance, along with the zero, with the number zero, and with the paper money, the banknote. It's an interesting book by Philip Rothman. It's called Signifying Nothing, which talks about the sign of zero, the sign of origin, that signifies nothing, in fact, but is the point of origin of everything. So this is the way in which, in the Renaissance and after the Renaissance, in the Enlightenment, people would start looking at things. They start looking at them through imagining a point of view, which was the point of view of the viewer. If you look at the pre-Renaissance paintings, you see that the perspective does not exist. In the paintings, the perspective is created by making objects smaller or bigger, not by arranging them on this kind of spatial depth visual artifice, which is the vista point. And Uccello has a very interesting painting in which Archangel, I think George or Michael, one of those two, is killing the beast, and half of the painting is realized with the old type of perspective by making the objects smaller or bigger, and the other half is it's made with the vista point, with the vanishing point. The old part is where the beast is drawn, and the new part is where the archangel is. It's like the fight between the old and the new. It's a very good painting. I'm sorry I don't have it. I couldn't find it on the internet, but you can find it for sure. Well, before designing streets, before streets look like this looks like a street. But before they look like this, there were no streets like this when this happened, and this was the stage in the Renaissance Italian theater. At the time in which the stages looked like this in the theaters, the streets were not at all like this. They were very built organically, more than like this. And the Renaissance architectural projects of the street originate in the representation of ideal or utopian spaces, particularly the theater stages. The invention of perspective implied major changes in the design of streets. And I quote from Widler, "For the laws of perspective were not only those of illusion or depicting three dimensions in two, but fundamentally the constructive laws of space itself. Thus the street, subject to perspective representation in the ideal theater, was transformed by this technique and shaped by it. In order to understand this transformation, one has to do away with that's what I'm thinking, with the Kantian idea of space as an a priori. The lived space is a direct result of architectural design, and our spatial perceptions are influenced by the rules of this design. The fact that we perceive things in space the way we do today is because 500 years ago somebody thought about that. And this is how, at the time that was in a theater, so it was an utopian space, but later on this kind of design has been applied directly to our cities. And this is what I call them the Paris stages. This is near Châtelet, and you can see in fact how the boulevards sort of reproduce that type of ideal utopian space, in which on every place in which you are on the boulevard, you are the generator of the view, right? Because the space is equal and built in perspective. So the operations of design and construction of the street following the rules of perspective created the possibility of a vista point, and moreover, it made any point along the street become a point of view. The rule of perspective centralized the role of visual perception, and at the same time, decentered the place of the perceiver in the case of transposition of the bidimensional plan to three-dimensional construction. For instance, while for the representation of a street on paper, the vanishing point is the place of the designer or of the plan viewer, once on a street built on such a plan, every place offers the same overarching perspective, combining the quality of panorama observer with the position of equal participant in the landscape spectacle of the street. Now I quote again. The tragic street was thus the instrument of urban control and regulation, inserted at the will of the planner into a hitherto private realm. The streets of Fontana and the boulevards of Haussmann, 2.5 centuries later, shared this common rule. But before the streets were projected and constructed in this manner, I say, architecture, following the advice of philosophers, came to regulate particular aspects or moments of life, for example, the industrial production or the sickness. I'll enter now into a discussion that you're probably very familiar with, the discussion around the idea of panopticon and visibility. This precedes the construction of the streets during Haussmann on the plans of the Renaissance. And the preoccupation with the geometry of space and spatial organization characterized the philosophy of Enlightenment. Diderot showed concern about the adequacy of the form of space to its function, principle to be applied in the construction of the places of production. This mode of thinking about space came out of the organization of production. The encyclopedists gave up the written word and used the rhetoric of images. This is interesting to remark that in order to explain their concepts about spatial organization of production, the encyclopedists gave up the written word and used the rhetoric of images. So what you have on the right side is the salt extraction at Arc en Salon in France, which is still there, you can visit it. And as you can see, it's very similar with the plan of panopticon that has been used by Foucault to illustrate his idea of surveillance, of generalized surveillance. The main difference, instead of that empty space in the middle of the panopticon, the industrial production there, in the middle you have the house of the director, of the manager. And the idea is this kind of transparent spatial organization rationally organize the work. This procedure of creating and using images that speak through themselves is twofold. One, pertinent in order to better illustrate the theory of the space, and second, because this new space is based on the idea of complete visibility, required in order to secure a harmonious surveillance of the production. Therefore, I say architecture gave us a symbolic code to industrial enterprise, oriented both in the directions of surveillance and of communitarian life, because the workers were supposed to live there at the same time, along with the director. They were not separated places of work and live. In his writings, Foucault always emphasized the relation between the mechanism of power and the forging of the subject, able to feel and resent the action of this specific form of power. Numerous critiques of modernity approach the subject of visibility in both senses, that is, the visibility as subject of analysis, and the subject emerging from the social organization around the optical ideas. This subject is endowed with certain qualities and has a specific relation with the power, that is, it establishes a reciprocity that places it in both a position of power and in the realm of powerless objectivation. Ledoux's salt exploitation, an industrial panopticon, transformed the industrial space into a theater scene and establishes a relation between workers and director that reminds Bidler of Rousseau's relation of reciprocity in the social contract, expressed in the mechanism of elections. If in the panoptical prison the relation is unilateral, in Rousseau's ideal case of the sovereign, the sovereign is under continuous scrutiny of his or her electors. Since the feasibility would secure knowledge, and knowledge is at the basis of rational organization of communitarian life, the eradication of invisible spaces would ensure the construction of the harmonious society. Logically, this principle extended in architecture beyond the construction of special institutions to the reformation of the spaces in the city and its transformation into a public realm, movement that both invested the space, with political qualities and disabled its capacities of political action by making it more accessible to forces of power. Haussmann project came to life in order to ensure the circulation of military troops and to render difficult the construction of barricades. At the same time, this kind of power throws the subject into the apathy of self and reciprocal contemplation. The new subject, the human being, replaces God in the cosmological system, as opposed to Jesus, fixed on the cross. Homo sacer is mobile, is able to move in the perspective plan without changing the perspective. This conception is coincident with the changing from the geocentric vision of the world to the heliocentric, with a vision that renounced the idea that the Earth is in the middle of the universe, but the Sun is at the middle of the universe. So the way we start thinking about ourselves is more that we are subjected to natural laws. Well, furthermore, I would argue that today we have even one step further into the creation of subjectivity. And I go back to clothing first. And I said, if you look at it, the theorists of fashion work in a paradigm that links clothing and identities. The idea generally agreed upon is that dress is a sign of identities. Underneath this idea lays a whole layer of philosophy of human being as entirely endowed with such a thing, that is, with identity. Fashion and the individual are parallel creations, individual in the sense of that we use in social sciences. And the fact that identity exists and that is necessarily attached to an individual is linked with a shift in the conceptualization of what human being means. The self becomes the natural carrier of identity. Moreover, the conviction that inner qualities are expressed by outside characteristics has to do with a very specific understanding of the idea of the self. The use of perspective implies the existence of a generative point of vision, and that is the human, the self that looks and generates the scene. This is the expression of a significant recentering of the world from an all-encompassing godly vision to the man-generated or self-generated perspective on the world. And I quote from Rothman, "In short, where medieval painted images make God's invisible prior world manifest through natural icons, Renaissance images represent an anterior visual world through a convention of science artificially produced by humanly imposed system of perspective." The vanishing point is simultaneously part of the representation as generative point and separated from it, similar somehow with the way in which the fashion self is part of clothing because signified by the clothes, but it is conceived as separated and autonomous entity. More clear on this, the idea that the way I dress tells who I am. It means it has a lot of things that are questions that we can deconstruct. First of all, that there is such a thing as self that is represented in the world, and that self is visible through the clothes I wear. It's a little bit like I was talking yesterday with Andres, a little bit like the clinical investigation, in which you attach to a malady or a sickness. To a sickness, you attach a series of signs that will tell you what the sickness is. And the idea is that that sickness exists. So I would call the modern sickness the self. Now, while some may observe the celebration of diversity in public space and the right to anonymity gained by the disengagement of personal gaze or action, other phenomena like the veiling point to ruptures in this perfect vision. You know, that utopian vision that everything is transparent, that boulevards are large, wherever we stay we have the perspective, and those kind of subjects, the subjects of modernity that are revealing.
Yes, however, it is very interesting that in the most known utopian vision, it is precisely closing.
Can you have the microphone too? Because otherwise she cannot translate.
Yes. Okay, so as I'm following all of your ideas are very well aligned and towards the political situation in France, it is very interesting to me that the veiling is precisely a great connection with the most known utopian idea, because if everything is transparent, but our innermost selves that more described with clothing, with his ideal regarding the prima condition for two people to marry. So there are different ways of, let's say, disguising that which Derrida would call the secret, and that is which is even a secret to ourselves, the rest. So in its political implications, to me, it is very hard to decide, because some people want to preserve their ethos whilst at the same time being citizens, whilst other people, being citizens as well, would like for that ethos to be consumed by their centric idea about what being a citizen is. So, of course, that would be like anti-utopian regarding, just for example, Westermarck, considering that ethical relativism is so far the best proposal. Because if we talk about the I as a device created by our society, we need to always keep in mind that I cannot be like modified in any utopian way by telling people what they should do. Because if there is any,
I'll get there if you let me.
Yes.
10 minutes more. I'll get exactly where. Yeah. So thanks for yeah. Thanks for the comment. It's exactly what I'm trying to get. And only one mention is that no, we cannot tell people what to do, but we educate them what to see. That was the argument in the beginning. Anyway, what's interesting is that veils in the public space, yes, they introduce this type of barrier that brings the ethos of the private to make a reference to into the public, and that's what deranges, in fact. And not only that, it does deranges, but at the same time it can be translated in the categories of the public, of the modern utopian secular space of France. It is accepted only if it signifies exoticism. Yeah? If it signifies exoticism, yeah, we're fine with it. If it doesn't, we're not fine with it. The modern individual has a sort of symbiotic relation with the fashion, and through fashion there is an aesthetic model of modernity and of the modern body. Muslim women's clothing constitutes an ideal background against which this image is projected, as in the Brazilian lipstick advertising. This is in Brazil, and the advertising says, "You who can take advantage of it, use it." referring to Brazilian unveiled women. These types of images create and perpetuate stereotypes of the exotic non-modern spaces and the bodies that populate it. And that's fine, but in the moment in which the veil appears into the public realm, like here, for example, these are two pictures both in France. This is a street which hosts a lot of boutiques of young Parisian designers, and this is a private show with a Kuwait buyer. As you see, she's veiled, she has a Moschino things, and she dresses, she buys the sort of the most avant-garde things from Paris. And they are, Middle Eastern clients are one of the most important clients of avant-garde fashion. But, however, there is a constant reticence towards viewing veiling as a voluntary action, the outcome of wearers' agencies. Also, there is a peculiar understanding of the veil as always signifying seclusion or resistance, struggle or submission, religion or interdictions, but almost never beautifying. Yeah, we don't talk about the veil as being a beautifying thing. Undoubtedly, there exists a constant, undeniable tendency for the beautification of dress, regardless of the time or space in which the dress is used. But not too many words are said about the aesthetics effort put into the creation and arrangement of the Islamic headscarf. And the association veil fashion is far from being current, if there is at all. Now there is much more. How is this position justified? Is it justified by the undeniable connection between fashion and modernity? Being fashionable or thinking fashion or putting time, energy and material resources in order to keep one's wardrobe up to date is a sign of specific relation with oneself and a particular understanding of social space, let us call a sign of modernity. Nevertheless, there is no specific rule nor argument regarding the actual aspect of the clothes. In social spaces that emphasize in one way or another a particular dress code, there is a very large possibility that people will play with that code, testing its limits and beautifying if possible. This has been said, still, the veil is a problem. Because the relation between the eye and the veil is a privileged one. While the originator of the gaze is usually the subject in a power position, the veil always interposes between the eye and the searched object, and thus generates both frustration and desire. It is interesting how the veil in both of these pictures is defined negatively, always in relation but never in itself. What do I mean? The veil is never the object of the gaze, but the object that stops the gaze before it reaches its objective, which is the body. And what is it? What is this privileged object of the gaze? The woman's body, the body in itself as the carrier of the divine truth, hence the narrative is organized around the idea of liberation. Why is it that the veil cannot be fashioned in some people's opinion? Because, I would say, the entire philosophy of the modern subject, identity, endowed self, that expresses its inner qualities through consumption and that signifies at the surface of the body, is denied through the veil. There is a message of progress and linear time, of bettering of the self, that fashion seems to transmit. If veil would be considered from its fashionable perspective in French political discourses, a brand new spatial organization should be envisaged outside the realm of visible. The veil dispute is not about women's liberation, nor about Islamic danger, but about the rationality of power knowledge optical complex. At the height of population administration techniques deployed by Western powers, we are witnessing the process of formation of the new branded subject of governmentality and the surveillance or total visibility required for this subject that may be voiced, but it is never endowed with language. It is a subject of the permanent state of exception, the purified individual with no characteristics other than their life to be rationally administered. The veil law, while reducing the meanings of the veil to a single signification, which is oppressive religion, attempts to recuperate the bodies into the biopolitical space through an inclusive exclusion of this object into the space of law, and through an exclusive inclusion of the bodies into the space of total visibility. Secularism is ingrained in and by architectural organization of the space, and its logical conclusion is the purified subject that is at the same time the object of the sovereign gaze and its subject. If veil would be The French law against the veil that finally was promulgated in 2004 is the expression of the desire to keep the veil where it is, in the center of the gaze, in fact. In 1989, an erotic misunderstanding erupted between Western Europe and the Eastern Bloc. Eroticism is present only when surrounded by fabric and textile, only in the presence of a minimal body covering. The architectural veil, the most concrete veil, that is the Berlin Wall, fell, leaving both Eastern and Western Europe in a mutual stunned contemplation of the reciprocal nakedness. The fear of the same occurrence animates the politician in the French Assembly. Including the veil through exclusion into the space of the law, they are reassured by its now eternal, although monosemic and absurd presence. There shall be no erotic misunderstanding. France peut réjouir, we can say. Well, this ethic of transparency is not only particular to France, of course, and although states like England, there's a different story of colonialism there, and you have an accent not on integration but on multiculturalism, view the idea of the veil completely different. However, transparency is sort of a requirement of our new type of power. And I just have another illustration of transparency, the gaze of that brings the body into the gaze, and how the idea of power that is diffused not only to the state but to our self-surveillance. In fact, is this? This is publicity. It's a publicity not for a plasma TV, as it can maybe show, but it's a publicity for a plasma screening. So you can buy something to screen yourself medically and to render your own body visible to yourself, right? This is taken this year in London. Workshop play. So what I'm saying is that visibility is a prevalent condition of the new types of power, and anything that would stop that visibility, that ethics of transparency, will be portrayed as either non-modern or ethnically or religiously marked, or something that anyway has to be has to fall down, like any type of wall. So the preservation of what, let's keep in the Derrida framework of that ethos, is not, it's ideally eliminated by politics. And not only this, but we do it to ourselves in other ways, and I do it also. I have a Facebook, no? How do you call that? Account? Yeah. A Facebook account. And I don't know if you read the declaration of Zuckerberg, but he believes that everything should be transparent. So I don't know what you believe, but I'd like to finish here and really hear what you believe.